Forestry has been a mainstay of the Prince George landscape since the early 1900s. The first sawmill in the Prince George area was built in 1909 by the Fort George Lumber and Navigation Company.
A lot of the development was up in the Eaglet Lake area. There was, we had the railway. They had to think about the roads weren't all here. And so I think it's really important to understand it was a very distributed sector. Pine wasn't even a component. We were after spruce and Douglas fir, spruce particularly, and balsam. So Eliza Lake was a big place. We had the research forest there. And so that was a very different sort of dispersal. And we've sort of seen the amalgamation of sawmills, thousands into hundreds and then into a handful. And they're located in sort of base communities, Mackenzie, Prince George, Vanderhoof, and that sort of thing.
The Grand Trunk Pacific Railway finally reached Prince George in 1914. It would have opened more doors for the industry, but its arrival was followed by the First World War. Demand for lumber dropped and a workforce went to Europe. It was a different story with the Second World War, when demand for wood products spiked. Production in the Prince George area jumped to 72 million board feet in the 1940s.
He's the boogie-woogie bugle boy of Company B.
But forestry took a turn in the early 1980s with the Bowron clearcut. It sparked international attention for all the wrong reasons. It was dubbed the largest clearcut in the world. Further to that, a decade later, the environmental community once again threw BC and its forestry practices into the international spotlight with the War in the Woods, protesting harvesting practices in the Clayoquot Sound. It dragged an industry kicking and screaming into more ecologically minded harvesting practices.
There's been a shift. People are moving more urban, a little more disconnected from where their food comes from and where their natural resources come from. And so I think maybe that's been a big part of it. But I think we look back to the 80s, Clayoquot Sound, the War in the Woods. Certainly labeled forestry as a bad player, but I think it was a change in social expectations. We practice forestry on Crown land, and the public own the land. And so we needed to shift, and the industry has. I think they've really, they've got a different focus. They're very professional about what they do. They're very good at what they do, and they consider what the public wants.
In the 1960s, many in Prince George will remember the arrival of a new forest industry, pulp.
Up until the 60s, the attitude in Prince George was make 2x4s, get them on the market, or dimensional lumber. And a guy named Peter Bentley from the coast came up and said, gee, we should have a pulp mill here. There hue and cry in the industry. Don't let the pulp guys in, or you'll put a sawmill out of business. Well, Peter was successful. We've got 3 mills here in town. I think the pulp industry has added a hell of a lot to this economy.
In the 1950s and 60s, wood production in the Prince George area rose from 380 million board feet to 1,250 million board feet.
I think the industry is, and not just the industry, let's broaden it, say the whole sector. Anybody that's working in the forest is very aware and needs skills related to not just timber, but the environmental and ecological values, the function of that ecosystem, how it works. And so there's a lot of planning, a lot of effort put into that now. And they're doing, I think, a much better job. So things have changed.
The mountain pine beetle epidemic began to make itself known in the Prince George timber supply area in 2001.
We do have to recognize, however, that in the north, beetle kill is a very, very serious problem and getting worse. So we have a very mild winter, as you see. And as a result of that, we are going to, I think, have to take far more, I wouldn't say drastic, but far more aggressive action to make sure that we get on top of this problem here.
It reached its peak between 2005 and 2007. It was in 2004, in response to that outbreak, that the Chief Forester increased the annual allowable cut, or the amount of wood the province allowed to be cut from Crown land, to nearly 15 million cubic meters.
What we know is in the short term, oftentimes from natural disasters, forest fires, pests, there's an uplift in the available timber because we want to get to that timber while it's still merchantable. The midterm and the long term are more of an issue and a concern.
But the days of an annual allowable cut of 15 million cubic meters of timber are over. In 2017, the Chief Forester introduced new AAC numbers in 2 phases. Beginning in October of that year and over the course of 5 years thereafter, the allowable cut in the Prince George timber supply area dropped to 8.3 million cubic meters, and a further 12% reduction will kick in October of 2022, down to 7.3 million cubic meters.
I don't have a particular estimate. What we do know is that the uplift in the annual allowable cut that came from the beetle infestation is now primarily over with, and so we're going back to looking at levels of what the annual allowable cut was before that happened, so back in the early 2000s. So if mills were predicated on that cheap and available fiber, then that's definitely on the downturn.
Last year, when housing starts in the United States began to rise and the amount of available lumber was down, lumber prices skyrocketed, hitting record highs of more than $650 per thousand board feet. Unheard of.
What followed that then was a very deep slide where we had 21 weeks of falling prices, and they fell back to just under $300. I think it was $298 in October, and so that's massive volatility. The effect of that is, you know, we all like high lumber prices, but that level of volatility isn't good. People can't plan. You get aberrant behavior in the market.
Nonetheless, industry analysts remain bullish on 2019.
Nevertheless, we see prices rising into late first quarter, early second quarter. So we think we'll see another, a 25% increase in prices going forward, and that should put everyone back into the black, let's say, which we haven't seen recently.
Susan Yurkovich agrees, predicting reasonable housing starts, about 1.26 million starts.
We also see lots of vibrancy in the repair and remodeling market. And we see, in the U.S. there's underbuild of housing, there's an aging housing stock, and there's a growing demographic that's moving into the household formation. So those things all, I think the demand fundamentals, we think are reasonable going forward. So I would agree with Russ. I think we're in a place where we're expecting to have a reasonable 2019. Maybe not, I hope not the kind of price volatility that we saw in 2018.
Canfor Corporation is Canada's largest softwood lumber producer, and it operates out of BC. It currently has 13 mills in the province. The softwood giant's predictions moving forward are also positive for this year.
We are, for sure. I mean, I think, as we tend to look at the markets and the industry too, for that matter, on a long-term basis. And so while we're interested in what things are going to look like over the next year, we're more interested in looking out 3, 5, and even 10 years. So we continue to be very bullish and very positive on the industry, really across the board and in really most of the markets that we operate within.
Today, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers' annual survey, 1 in 5 jobs in the Cariboo, Northeast and Nechako are connected to forestry directly. In 2017, the industry province-wide contributed nearly $13 billion to the province's GDP. But while Russ Taylor is bullish on 2019, he is also predicting mill closures based on a lack of fiber.
Having revised our forecast since, we see another, 1 million to 1.5 million cubic meters of timber reductions going forward, less logs available to mills, and that should translate into 2, 3, 4 mills. Maybe it may be what we're seeing right now, shift reductions, not total mill closures, but the equivalent of 3 to 5 mills closing over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's the BC story.
It's a sentiment that is shared by the Northern Development Initiatives Trust, whose role is to predict economic trends and redress them throughout all of northern BC.
We as an organization have seen the writing on the wall, and I think most forest companies and most people in communities have seen this for quite some time. There's going to be some mill rationalization over the next few years. We expect it'll be more than 1 mill. Where those mills are, we don't know. What we do know is that they're going to be located in central and northern BC.
Since the annual allowable cut was reduced in 2017 because the mountain pine beetle wood is no longer viable, BC's forests have suffered yet another killer. unprecedented wildfires in 2 consecutive years.
The forest fires don't really hurt the production so much in the short term, except for closures during fire season. You know, there's a salvage program that follows, so you're able to salvage the logs for the next 2, maybe 3 years before they have limited value. But it affects the long term because all those trees that were burnt, they're not salvaged, and therefore it takes away from the long term timber harvest.
It all paints a bleak picture of the industry, and 2 new bark beetles are on the horizon, the Douglas fir beetle to the west and the spruce beetle to the north. But there are those who feel government and industry have brought it upon themselves.
We have built super mills in this province. Like British Columbia leads the way in technology in forestry. They've done a good job. But we have super mills now that can consume more logs than we can grow. And we have to rationalize that and come and figure out how we're going to adjust in the future to accommodate that. We just can't produce the amount of wood from these mills that our landscape can't grow.
Mike Morris has time-lapse video showing how good a job BC producers have done in dealing with salvage. The orange-coloured specks that appear around northern BC represent new cut blocks that have been harvested between 1985 and 2016.
I travel around quite a bit. I fly back and forth in this province several times a week sometimes. And that's all I do is look out the window and look at the forestry activity and whatnot across the province. Last summer, I also took a month and I drove through hundreds, perhaps thousands of kilometers of resource roads just to have a look for myself. And we don't have the wood left. The pine beetle has had a devastating effect. In my riding alone, there's probably accumulated 1 million hectares of spruce has been killed in the last 5 years. And that's where the wood's going to come from for now, the wood that they can get at. But the next couple of years after that, I think we're going to be a mere shadow of what we are today.
I think it's safe to say that I do have worries about the future of the industry, yes.
Why?
I think that we're all grappling with the reality, and we've known this for a while, so it's not a surprise. But the reality is that we know we're heading into a scenario where our forestry sector, our interior forestry sector, is going to be smaller in the future for quite a period of time, largely based on the availability of timber.
One word rings in the ears of many: access. Access to fibre has become a concern for the dimension lumber producers in particular, who say log costs are too high in BC despite the condition of the wood and how far it is located from the mills.
It would be the single biggest challenge and opportunity, I think, at the same time. And when you think of access to timber, like you say, it's a competitive access to the right timber. And you can get timber, but it's maybe not the type of timber that you need to get the product outturns that you need to supply to your customers worldwide. And so that's our biggest challenge. It's the competitive part of it.
Don Kane says BC companies are competing with the world, and in many cases places where trees grow significantly faster than they do here. Adding to access are other external factors like getting the product to market. The most recent example is Alberta's move to put oil in rail cars.
This is not the long-term answer. It absolutely is not. But until pipelines are built, we need to move more oil by rail.
We would say, aside from fiber, probably the second, tied with people, the second biggest challenges and that we've got to be concerned about is supply chain, which is really transportation in the case you talk about. So yes, we are concerned for sure with the oil and gas and what that's going to do to availability of not so much rail cars, because they're different rail cars, but track space and just the logistics of being able to transport it in a timely fashion.
And getting that final product to the customer is critical for companies like Canfor. If a customer doesn't get what they ordered, they move on.
The Home Depots of the world, Lowe's of the world, all the big customers that we deal with on a global basis, you know, they see in British Columbia, you know, what are you going to do to ensure that we have the supply for the future? So we felt it upon ourselves, if we're going to grow the company, that's where we had to go. We have to diversify. It makes sense for a number of reasons. And if you look at British Columbia, between we got the Species at Risk Act, we've got softwood lumber, we got tariffs, we got transportation that you mentioned, and we got forest fires, and we got beetle. So we got a lot of things that we're having to deal with, and which we think we've done a good job at overall collectively between us and government. But we have to be diversified. We have to diversify because it's really about our customers. And this whole deal that we did in Sweden was really driven by our customers and their request that we expand elsewhere to make sure that we have the supply for them for the future, because they're all growing at rapid rates.
It meant curtailments in several northern interior sawmills over the Christmas and into the new year. At the same time, the larger dimension lumber producers are buying mills in the southwestern United States and, in the case of Canfor, into Sweden. Kane's reaction to any suggestion of moving out of BC was swift.
Absolutely not. I mean, in terms of Canfor in British Columbia, we've been here since 1938. Our head office has been in Vancouver since 1938. We have a regional office right here in Prince George. And we have 13 sawmills and 4 pulp mills and plus 3 pellet plants. So we've got a huge footprint in British Columbia. We think we've made basically the tough decisions that we've had to make in terms of operations over the years, and I think we've done a good job as a company over the years to really make sure that the areas that we operate now are solid and sustainable for the future from a fiber point of view.
Joel Mackay says there are a number of reasons why doing business in the southern U.S. is more appealing at the moment.
One reason is that it's private timberland. And so from that perspective versus Crown land, they're a lot more nimble. They're able to control the destiny of that land as a licensee more than they are here in British Columbia. Certainly the second piece is that the species they're harvesting down there has a much quicker turnaround time than it takes to grow a pine tree in northern BC.
A third reason is that the buyer of your product, if you are a Canfor or a West Fraser or an Interfor, is in your backyard. There are no transportation costs, nor would you as a company have costly and complicated trade disputes. All of it adds up. For Russ Taylor, those investments elsewhere are keeping the mills in BC running, albeit on shorter shifts.
These companies have to grow, and they've all realized that with the mountain pine beetle in BC, that was their signal to stop looking at growing aggressively in BC because there's only so much timber and so many mills. So they went where the fiber was, and that's the U.S. South, and that got even better after the housing market collapse in 2009. All of a sudden, with all the curtailments and the slow buildup in housing starts, there's now even a surplus of timber around. That means log prices in the U.S. South have not changed since 2009. They're almost the lowest in the world right now. So, and yet they have the highest prices in North America for lumber. So it's a great place to be. And so right now there's the companies are making, anybody in the U.S. South is making lots of money. That's where the high margins are. In BC, it's, of course, it was a good place to work or to operate mills when the prices were high. And today, with the prices where they are, with also paying a 20% import duty on shipments to the U.S., we're now the high-cost producer, especially as green timber prices are going up and up now because there's more demand. So the BC companies made the right call. They went to the U.S. and the U.S. South in particular to grow their companies. It means that they'll have, from the earnings they make elsewhere in the U.S. South, they can reinvest back into BC. If they only had mills in BC at today's prices, they would have no money to reinvest. So that's kind of their diversification strategy that's played out very nicely for them.
But the decision doesn't sit well with the unions that represent BC workers. We asked the union if they see mills in BC shuttering.
Don Kane vehemently disagreed with something that I had asked him about. I said, when you see 10% curtailments here, another curtailment, buying up mills in South Carolina, buying into a company in Sweden, a lot of people might see that as an exit strategy.
Well, it's pretty hard not to, given, again, where our fiber supply is within BC. I think I read a document, they talk about, another 50 years, we'll be back in another new growth of timber and things will be going again. But yeah, and when I look at it, it's money that's made from companies in Canada that they're buying up all of these other industries with. Is it going to help back in this province, in the communities to our members? Kind of doubt it.
Don Kane is the first to admit growth in BC is challenging.
For us, it's really about diversification, and if you I always come from the customer standpoint, and if you look at British Columbia, with the AACs coming down, the opportunity to expand in British Columbia is not great. Really, the opportunity in British Columbia is to advance the business by utilizing the fiber in an increasingly more profitable way through really focusing on customization and value, and really focus, like I mentioned, on value versus volume.
Government has made some recent changes to policy to, in their words, keep forestry jobs in BC.
The Coast Forest Sector Revitalization Initiative, there haven't been any major changes from a policy, regulatory, or legislative perspective to forestry since 2003, and so long overdue. It's aimed at making sure that we process more logs in BC, that there's more jobs in BC because of that, and better practices around utilization of what's in the forest, leaving less material behind after harvesting takes place.
And Donaldson says something similar could be coming to northern BC.
There's a suggestion something like that, akin to that, will be coming here. Would that be good news?
I believe it will be good news. I did talk myself and a couple of our guys talked to Minister Donaldson, and they figure by maybe April-ish they're going to be making another announcement in the interior, similar to what they did on the coast. And I think any time that we can keep raw logs in the country or in our province, ship them to our communities and have them milled in the mills that are currently here is a good thing.
But it's not all doom and gloom in forestry. It means producers have to think outside the box, be innovative, something Joel Mackay says BC's industry has been doing for the last 100 years.
I mean, it was not so long ago where we had 700 mills in the Prince George area. They were largely mom and pop shops, and they were cutting 2x4s, as you say. And so we've gone from a province where way back at the start of the 20th century, it was railroads and railroad logging and one log loads in trucks, exporting logs to creating a lumber industry, to creating an MDF and an OSB industry, to pulp that came in the 60s in the interior, much earlier on the coast, and then most recently the pellet mills as well, and then the biomass and the energy projects that are attached to some of our mills as well.
Mike Morris wrote a position paper in 2015 as the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Forests, Lands and Natural Resource Operations. It looked at a more sustainable forest practices.
I produced a report back in 2015 called Getting the Balance Right, and I addressed a lot of those issues in there. But I look at the Forest and Drainage Practices Act. I think it was a necessary thing. It was developed back in the early 2000s to replace the Forest Practices Code. It basically turbocharged the forest industry. The problem with legislation is that it's not nimble enough to address the mountain pine beetle. It's not nimble enough to address the fir beetle or the spruce beetle or any of those other dynamics that have come into play. And the forest companies will operate to the letter of the law. So they have operated under FERPA, under the Forest and Drainage Practices Act, to the letter of the law, which they're allowed to the detriment, I believe, of our forest sector itself. I think we've over-harvested, and we're going to be paying the price because, like I said, we're going to be the forest industry in BC will become a mere shadow of what it's been over the last 20 to 30 years.
He says the report looks at how natural resource activity like forestry and environmental values can coexist, but it may require redefining what sustainable means.
The forest industry has claimed that they are internationally known for sustainable forest management. But I think we need to define exactly what sustainable means. Is sustainable planting a tree down, or planting a tree, cutting it down, planting a tree, cutting it down? or sustainable means that we're also paying attention to all the other biodiversity that comes with a forest. The wildlife populations, the spring runoffs, the hydrology that affects that forestry has on the land with these massive clear cuts, the kinds of trees that we plant, the way we address wildfires. I think it's all one complete package. So I think we have to revisit exactly what sustainability is all about.
While the forest industry has been part of Prince George and region's history for 100 years, a new player has entered the scene.
In 1998, the founder of the company, John Swan, who everybody knows, and he is the founder of this industry internationally, he was stuck with some product, and he shipped it to Sweden, and everyone said it won't work. Well, that was the beginning of what today is about a 15 to 20 million ton international and growing at 20% per annum business.
Don STEELE is the head of Pacific Bioenergy. He says for the industry to succeed, there needs to be a change in attitude. His words, saying they can make use of the wood that the Dimension lumber producers don't.
The ministry, I understand, has recently stopped the massive harvest of mountain pine beetle because it's no longer saw log. That's perfect for us. We've got to get access to that. We need attitude change to move into that.
An hour and a half south of Prince George, there is mountain pine beetle blowdown in piles. Contractors like Freya Logging are collecting that wood and dividing it between different users. Some will be used as saw logs, while the rest is either piled or chipped and sent to places like Pacific Bioenergy.
Essentially what we're just trying to do is utilize a lot of this fiber that normally would be burnt and a lot of it going to our pellet facility in Prince George where we'll pelletize it and then ship it overseas for use for power plants and stuff. So yeah, we're just going through these piles. It's all dead, dry, beetle-killed pine. And then we're merchandising out with the processor here. To get some saw log out to some of the mills in town, and then pulling out biomass logs as well for us to go to our facility. And then in behind, actually, we'll grind the remaining and bring that in as well. So at the end, it'll be basically full utilization of all the fiber here, and almost zero waste.
It's a complicated question with a simple answer. The way you get at it is you get innovative and you start looking at the forest from a different perspective. You start thinking out of the box, and then you say, where is there a market and how do we get this stuff to the market? So there's tools to do that, and so we've been sort of looking at different ways.
That's a huge focus now just because of what we've seen.
In March, BC's Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development launched plans for dealing with the pending wildfire season.
The Forest Enhancement Society of BC funding that I described, $134 million, is being allocated for activities related to forest health, but directly related to wildfire management. So that's clearing a lot of the coarse woody debris out of forests around communities. We've had examples already where fire guards have been built through FES-BC funding in conjunction with communities and local contractors. So that work is ongoing.
Connor O'Donnell is the supervisor of forestry operations for Pacific Bioenergy. He says the use of slash burning is archaic.
It's definitely frustrating when there's things, that you see people lighting up, torching up fiber that we can utilize, right? And sometimes it's just little hurdles that have to be overcome that make it so that we can get it. And it's just a different frame of thinking, right? For quite a few years, it's been the standard thing to do. You pull the saw logs out, then you burn the rest. But now there's a whole new market for biomass logs, and for us or other facilities that can be used.
But the rethinking has to start at the top.
This is a new industry, and as such, we need an attitude change. We're good customers, believe it or not, of the forest industry. We've paid hundreds of millions of dollars to the tenured industry, which is tenured for its security. We've paid them hundreds of millions of dollars for what they used to burn. Okay? But we're still not viewed as a valued customer to them, and so on and so forth. That has to change.
Unfortunately, this crew is under the gun from government. If they can't get this wood off the land before a certain deadline, these piles will be burned to make way for tree planters in the summer.
Grappling with reality is that we're pretty lean on fiber.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the challenge. It's great to be innovative, but it all boils down to that stick of wood.
Yeah, it all boils down to, can you get the tree out of the forest economically? What can you turn it into? How much value can you get out of that single tree? And how many jobs are attached to that? And so that picture is always changing. We're seeing lots of automation, we're seeing lots of efficiency in our mills, all in an effort to make them more profitable so that they stay open and support the jobs we have in our region. But the actual jobs in the mill are very different today than they were 20 or 30 years ago, not least of which the number of jobs. And so you're right. It does depend on timber, it does depend on the availability of fiber, and the reality of where we're at in British Columbia right now is, in the interior at least, coming out of the mountain pine beetle epidemic and now the struggles with spruce beetle and fir beetle, we're into a scenario for a period of time where we're going to have less fiber available.
Some of this before we grind it.
While industry on one side is attempting to affect change at a government level, others are affecting change from within. Canfor Pulp takes the waste produced from Dimension lumber, the chips, to make pulp. Now the waste from the pulp process will make oil. It means every part of a single tree will be put to use, lowering the pulp giant's carbon footprint.
You start with a biocrude that contains fractions for fuel and fractions for chemicals, but initially we're likely to try and refine all of the biocrude fuels because there are significant incentives available today for fuels. But we are forecasting that our production costs will be competitive with fossil crude even without incentives.
For sure, and like you mentioned, the bio-crude side, the alternative fuel side, green fuel side, we're certainly interested in. We've made some great progress there with Lysella, or we call it Sentry now, and our pulp group's been working hard on that. We've got a great partner in Australia, and we've got some good partners even in Finland as well. But the biofuel overall, we see that as a big opportunity going forward. And a lot of it comes down to how can we utilize more of the forests, more of the logs that we are entrusted with. And so whether that's biofuels, whether it's just simply getting more value out of the existing fiber supply that we have. So we focused hard on non-dimensional products, more specialty products around the world, really, that don't typically compete in commodity markets. We're certainly looking at that.
Kane says another challenge is people, or the lack thereof. He says major projects means it's tough to keep qualified workers in Canfor operations, and it's not getting easier, with doors opening everywhere. He says the company gets into high schools, universities, and colleges, encouraging young people to get into the industry.
The opportunities today are significant, and it's getting the message out to students and to even competing industries, people that are working in competing industries, about the forest industry in the future. And from the green attributes, the environmental benefits, to the technology that we utilize now compared to what we used to use in terms of optimization and computer imaging and all the things that we're doing technology-wise, product development, new products. We're operating around the world now as opposed to just in, say, British Columbia. All of those things, if you're a young person today and you're looking at choices of industries, I don't think there's a brighter period of time, a brighter time than now to really be considering that. So it's really in our court. I mean, again, it's up to us, how good of a job we do to get that message out as an industry and as a company.
We've seen a lot of student interest. We used to run 2 sections of the program with lots of students, 37 students intake. We're now 1 section and 22 students as an intake. It's still a popular program. We're oversubscribed, but we've lost Northwest Community College's forestry program and Northern Lights Community College's forestry program along the way. So, and it was partly because people turned away from it. They didn't want to work in forestry. They didn't see it as a viable sector, in spite of the fact we continued to have demands, good jobs.
Ed Morris says the nature of forestry education has changed, moving from an exclusively forest-based program to a much more diverse set of skills.
Still at core is about, development and forest practice, but we bringing in more ecology and more the environmental interests. So we've actually got students that have gone through our program They say there's an awful lot of forestry in this program, but they've gone to work for mines in the environmental department is a big one. We've gone to work for some of the environmental companies, but still most of our students end up working in the forest sector specifically.
An example of the changing face of education is the research forest granted to the college. The 12,000-hectare piece of land supports research around everything from bark beetles to planting different tree species in anticipation of climate change.
We called it applied research, fairly short-term, local, sort of something that would really benefit an industry sector. So it's included things like seed transfer, tree transfers, looking at that. We've looked at some wildlife use of coarse woody debris by birds. There's a study that, now this is some collaboration with UNBC, Roy Ray's some work with him around moose.
He says technology is creeping into the education in a big way, and there's no place that incorporates technology more than what goes on in the Wood Innovation and Design Center. It's here they look at wood much differently.
So all of these steel beams are there so that we can build reaction frames.
That is part of what is happening inside the Wood Innovation Research Lab, the latest facility of UNBC's to conduct research into the capacity of wood for structural use.
When you have a wooden house, you have like the walls that also need to resist the seismic loading. So the walls need to be strong enough, but they also need to be, well, the term is ductile, but like flexible enough so that the house can move a little bit and absorb the energy from an earthquake. With the setup we have, we could do 2 floors, but testing 2 floors is incredibly complex, and you don't actually gain a lot of additional input. So what most people do and what we were going to do this summer is test like one wall. But what we will, like in steps, increase the complexity. So we will take 1 wall element and just see whether it behaves according to our assumptions, and then we take 2 and 3 wall elements. Wood is a very, very nice material, but it has a lot of challenges we have to overcome, and we can overcome them by combining it with steel and concrete. For instance, a wooden floor for longer spans is simply not a good solution. But if we add a composite concrete layer on top of it, that floor performs like almost as you would be accustomed to in a concrete building.
But the structure of wood isn't the only research being undertaken in the lab.
In our group, we have one colleague who looks at the acoustic performance of wooden buildings. So he wants to see how we can limit the amount of sound that can travel from one unit to the next. And he will build a little test facility for testing acoustic performance. Then if you know Guido, he's working on envelope performance. So like how much energy do you need to heat a building or cool a building. And myself and one colleague who are like the structural researchers.
And a few short meters away, the real workhorses of the lab, the hydraulics.
So those are like super high-end hydraulic actuators. So it's basically a hydraulic pump that we can control like super precisely in terms of how fast they move and how strong they push. And so they can be mounted onto the wall, onto the floor, or onto those steel frames with one end, and then with the other end, they push against the wood pieces that we're testing.
The larger 2 are 500 kilonewtons, while the smaller 2 are 250 kilonewtons. They will be used on the concrete walls behind us to conduct flexibility tests this summer.
The first big project we have will be those shear walls. So we have wooden walls built in here, and then we use these actuators to push against the wall to see how strong and flexible the wall is.
Gotcha.
And then, so later the year, we're going to mount them into those steel frames and push onto floors.
The lab has seen some industrial application using the equipment on these chunks of Douglas fir, and the work conducted in the lab has an end run.
Ultimately, we hope the industry makes use of it. In the first step, what my research is for is to inform code on standard revisions. So I'm on the standard committee that develops the wood design standard for Canada. And the research that I do and my colleagues in this field do basically informs the standard. And every 5 years we publish a new standard that pretty much reflects the newest state of the art. And then it goes into the engineering community because they follow the design standard.
And so that could affect things like the BC Building Code, for example.
Yes, indirectly. Like for instance, the BC Building Code, the limitations on how tall you can build with wood, like it was changed to 6 stories in 2009, and it has now been changed to 8 stories. Like those changes are informed because the material standards provide the provisions that basically show engineers how to design structures like that safely.
The city of Quesnel, 12,000 strong. Its mayor, Bob Simpson, refers to it as the most forestry-dependent community in the province.
We have 2 pulp mills, an MDF plant, a plywood plant, very large sawmills, a remanufacturing facility.
And he may be right, but it means the predicted downturn in forestry could have dire consequences for that community. Bob Simpson's motto, when handed lemons, make lemonade.
So we're asking the question, how do we reinvent our manufacturing so that it matches what's going to come off of the future forest land base? Because it's not going to be saw log like we've all depended on for the last number of generations.
Anything we use petrochemicals?
A vacant floor in City Hall is being converted into a Forestry Innovation Centre.
The Forestry Innovation Centre is a place for us to showcase all of the local wood that we produce now. So dimensional lumber, plywood, MDF, decorative finishing wood products from one of our industry partners. And it's also a place to showcase all the research and development and really the future of what wood manufacturing will be here in Quesnel.
ERIN Robinson has been hired by the city of Quesnel to think of forestry in a new way.
Anything we make with petrochemical plastics and make it out of a wood, so single-use plastics, anything within your household that we currently make out of petrochemical plastics such as garbage cans, Tupperware containers, all of that can be replaced with a wood biocomposite.
The city is also working with FP Innovations on cutting-edge technology called nanocrystalline cellulose. According to its own website, here's how FP Innovations describes nanocrystalline cellulose. Cellulose nanocrystals has the potential to generate a new bioeconomy based on innovative, high environmental value approaches. It will allow creation of new products while adding value to existing products. Cellulose nanocrystals can economically be extracted from trees. Its properties and many potential forms allow many uses, including iridescent or magnetic films, pigments, inks, cosmetics, and even biocomposites for bone replacement. These nanomaterials and their byproducts can be used in many industrial sectors, particularly aerospace, medical devices, and even forest products.
And so they can do some really interesting things with that, such as making print color for magazines, car paints, cosmetics. They can turn this little iridescent crystal to any color of the spectrum. They're calling it the new color of color, so that we can replace a lot of the toxic dyes that we use currently in cosmetics or car paint or magazines, and actually use this wood product in a very innovative way. And if we can tap into something like that here in Quesnel, we can switch making dimensional saw logs into the lumber that we still will do, but have a really high-paying industry that's innovative out of a wood product.
While it is still very early technology, only in the test phase, Robinson says work is being done at a pulp mill in Montreal. The research uses wood at the cellular level. The type of tree doesn't matter. There would be no need for the monoculture of spruce, pine, and fir as there is today.
So we're leading that process, and as a forest-dependent community, we think that by taking that leadership role, we put ourselves in a no excuses situation where we can go to the government saying, here's some solutions you can act on, instead of going to the government saying, we have a problem, what are you going to do to fix it?
But government is still a critical player. They are the overseers of the forests.
It does, for sure. So we're working closely with the science community and the provincial government and our First Nation government partners to come up with the data and come up with the answers to this. But essentially, yes, it'll be up to the land managers to implement these things. But we're really making the argument that ecology underpins everything. It's not a three-legged stool like we looked at it for years. It's actually the bottom of that pyramid. Without ecology, we can't have a functioning social structure and we can't have a functioning economy.
But I certainly would say we've been innovative for decades. We know forestry, that's what we're good at in British Columbia. We'll continue to get there, but it is going to require some challenges, some tough conversations around, okay, what are we going to do differently in order to make this happen?